Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Michael Costa, and I'm the Executive Director here at Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra. We're thrilled to have all of you here tonight, especially those of you that made the trek to this brand new venue for us. It's a different space, but one that we're very excited for, and we hope that you'll enjoy the experience of hearing the concert this evening with the orchestra and our guest artists, Julian Wachner and Andreas Scholl. We also have another very special treat for you, which we're delighted to be able to share this evening. As part of our pre-concert talk, we are participating in an initiative by the San Francisco Conservatory of Music called the Rubin Institute for Music Criticism. It's a phenomenal institute, and I'm going to let someone wiser and more knowledgeable about it speak. But we are very excited because part of the advantage of this is that you're going to get to hear this evening from Heidi Waleson, a prominent critic in the United States who writes for the Wall Street Journal, among other publications, and is an incredibly gifted person in terms of understanding what we do at Philharmonia Baroque and many other period instrument groups. So one other thing I want to note for you, for those of you who have any interest in music criticism, is that you too can be a critic as part of this. There's a $1,000 prize available for you to write a small review of tonight's concert and submitting it. There's information on a poster out there, and the San Francisco Conservatory president is going to talk to you a little bit more about that. And that is my segue to introduce David Stull, who's the fairly new president of the San Francisco Conservatory of Music. David's been a great partner already to Philharmonia Baroque Orchestra, and our relationship has begun to grow, and we're thrilled to continue that with this evening. So David, welcome.
Thank you, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here and to see all of you here this evening for this pre-concert talk by Heidi. First of all, I would like to point out, if you want to have an incredibly challenging position, run a period instrument ensemble in the United States of America and do so successfully with the great programming of Philharmonia Baroque. And Michael, sincerely, congratulations, because this is a fantastic achievement. And I would like to offer a round of applause to Sue. Tonight, first of all, it celebrates many things for all of us. This institute is a collaboration between the San Francisco Symphony, the San Francisco Opera, Cal Performances, Philharmonia Baroque, and a collaboration of several institutions as well. Yale has sent a delegation of students, Oberlin has sent students, Cal, Stanford, and of course SFCM. Bringing together these young students with great critics, not just the fantastic critics we are fortunate to have here in San Francisco, but also those from the New Yorker, keynote address New York Times, but also the Washington Post and others. We have just an assemblage of individuals who care very, very much about discourse and music. We think about why it is important to have discourse in music. I urge you to really reflect on what it is to have music in your life. And the reality is that for all of us who attend concerts, it's often the vantage point of those who spend all of their time attending concerts which inspires us to go, or sometimes not to go. But historically, when we examine criticism, what we find is that it's not simply what we know from the standpoint of what happened in a composer's life, but how a critic reacted to a concert that tells us more about that period history than just about anything else. This discourse is critical to our understanding of ourselves. This evening, if you want to discover how difficult it is to become a critic, I encourage you to do so. And now is your opportunity. There is a chance, if you go on to the SFCM Rubin website, you will find a place where after this evening's performance, you can submit a review, up to, I believe, 400 words, if I recall correctly, of tonight's concert. I think what you find that when you listen to music, it is one thing. You have to listen to music with a recognition that you must write about it and take a position, in a position that would be publicly scrutinized. It is something else entirely, and you realize how difficult a task it is. And so this entire institute is about really bringing this next generation of young critics to a level of excellence where whatever medium they may be working in, they understand how to offer perspective rather than simply reaction, and ultimately a take, if you will, on art as it unfolds before us. When we think about great critics, it is hard for me to create a list of any nature at the top 5 level without including Heidi Waleson. Heidi's work at the Wall Street Journal has been extraordinary over many years. Heidi has not only written for the Wall Street Journal, but has contributed to Opera News and numerous other publications, literally hundreds of essays and articles and reviews, which have inspired us, caused us to think, caused us to imagine the opera or the work she's reviewed as it's happening, and really examine music at the highest level. For great critics, the key is causing us to really investigate music, but not distancing us from the work itself. It is such an interesting enterprise they have to undertake. It is a great privilege to welcome to the podium Heidi Waleson. Please join me in bringing her vote.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. Thanks so much for everybody for being here. And it's really a privilege to be part of the Rubin Institute this week in San Francisco. It's really a lot of fun. So, the title of my lecture is Early Music Goes Mainstream, but I'm sort of going to veer out from that a little bit. But I started thinking about this because I have a very, very deep interest in historically informed performance on period instruments. And it's very exciting to be in the Bay Area, which is a center of American pioneers of the movement. And Philharmonia Baroque, as I'm sure you all know, or at least the people who are regular Philharmonia people know, was founded in 1981 by the harpsichordist Laurette Goldberg, and is still going strong now after 33 years. And the Berkeley Festival was launched in 1990, and the area boasts a very important concentration of performers, ensembles, and instrument makers, like John Phillips, one of the premier harpsichord builders of the world. And it's a city that takes early music very seriously. So if historical performance is a mainstream activity anywhere in the United States, it is here. There is important activity elsewhere, of course, Tafelmusik in Toronto, Boston, with the biennial Boston Early Music Festival and the Handel and Haydn Society, which went to period instruments under Christopher Hogwood in 1986, after Philharmonia. Apollo's Fire has made a dent in Cleveland, and now Trinity Wall Street, under the leadership of tonight's conductor, Julian Wachner, has turned into a major player on the New York scene with the Trinity Baroque Orchestra and the Trinity Choir. These are all the children of the great European pioneers who began bringing this music back in the 1950s and 1960s, people like Gustav Leonhardt, Nicholas Harnoncourt, Franz Breuchen, and Honor Bilsma. Tonight's program is built around Bach and Handel, who are, of course, cornerstones of early music and exact contemporaries. They were both born in 1685, although Handel did outlive Bach by 9 years. One can't say that the historical performance movement reminded us about Bach and Handel, since they have long been part of the performance culture, but some of you may remember how they used to be done, with enormous choruses and orchestras for the B minor Mass and Handel's Messiah, hundreds of people. Historical performance and period instruments took the 19th century weight off the shoulders of this music. Baroque violins with gut strings and Baroque bows compel a different kind of playing, one that demands articulation, breath, and rhythmic flexibility rather than the overall goal of the singing line, though we do get that too. The wind instruments are tangier, the brass has more punch, and without the constant vibrato, the textures and the individuality of the instruments are more pronounced. The same goes for voices, with singers trained in the style using vibrato sparingly for color and expressivity rather than all the time. The music sounds startlingly different, and I would say more alive. And the smaller choirs, you don't have to follow Joshua Rifkin and insist on only one voice per part, makes an enormous difference. It used to be a given that modern instrument players looked down on historical performance performers. The assumption was that they weren't good enough to play modern violins, for example. That was a generational prejudice that I believe is now passing, and we now have modern musicians trying out Baroque bows and pianists learning to play the harpsichord. Last year, Carter Bray, the principal cellist of the New York Philharmonic, decided to perform the Bach cello suites on a period instrument, and he talked extensively about his learning curve and how illuminating that was. One of the biggest mainstreaming occurrences of the last few years was the founding of the Juilliard Historical Performance degree program. That center of traditionalism recognized that historical performance was something that today's musicians need to learn and put a lot of resources behind it, to say nothing of exponentially increasing the number of early music performances in New York and unleashing a new flood of players onto the scene. One of the great gifts of the historical performance movement are the composers that it has unearthed. 40 years ago, who was playing or singing Porpora, or Stradella, or Kapsberger, or Marin Marais, or Forqueray, and even Charpentier and Rameau and Lully, who might seem actually very mainstream at this point to some of us, thank you, William Christie, and Monteverdi. Digging around in libraries was half the fun. All of a sudden, musicians turned into scholars looking for new old music and trying to figure out what those sources and their instruments told them about how it wanted to be played. Tonight's program stalwarts, Bach and Handel, familiar as they were, got looked at from a new perspective, and in a way, they became new composers. I'm going to talk mostly about the vocal music since it's my thing. So what have we learned from historical performance about Bach and Handel, both incredibly theatrical composers, but with very different goals? If nothing else, the historical performance movement demonstrated that there is more to Handel than Messiah. Handel's operas have joined the mainstream, and we've now seen lots of them. There are 42. I'm counting, I think I've seen maybe 30. So that's very exciting. There are even more if you count some of the English oratorios like Semele and Theodora that are getting done in stage versions and being called operas. And we trust Handel now. In the past, the few operas that were performed were all, if they were performed at all, they were cut. Their da capo arias truncated, and the roles that were originally written for castrati were sung down an octave by tenors and baritones. The famous city opera Giulio Cesare in 1966 that put Beverly Hills on the map, Caesar was sung by Norman Treigle, a bass baritone. Of course, Handel wrote that role and many of the other principal heroic roles of his operas for castrati, who were all the rage in Italian opera of the early 18th century, and when Handel embarked on his 30-year operatic adventure in London. The male hero roles in both the operas we'll hear arias from tonight, Giulio Cesare from 1724 and Rodelinda from 1725, were written for the alto castrato Senesino, who was Handel's exact contemporary, and he was said to be the most admired male singer of his time. The great castrati had clarion power and a plangent timbre somewhere between the voice of a boy and a woman, and the character and the pitch of that voice is essential to the interpretation of Handel's operas. Since we no longer castrate boy sopranos in the hope that they will become great singers, we are fortunate to have an ever-increasing number of inspiring countertenors like tonight's soloist, Andreas Scholl, men who sing in that higher range and can give us the authentic sense of what those arias were supposed to sound like at their proper pitch. Countertenors have been around for a long time, but it's only in recent years that a number of them have moved into the operatic realm, developing the kind of volume needed to match their female counterparts and the orchestras. In a recent Opera News article, the young countertenor Anthony Roth Costanzo, whom some of you may have heard as Armando in San Francisco's opera Partenope, did anybody see it? Yeah? Oh, good. San Francisco Opera. I missed it. I'm very sad. Talked about how when he was 15 and figuring out his voice post-boy soprano phase, he sounded, and this is his quote, like a screaming banshee. And Steve Blyer, the pianist and coach who worked with him, is quoted in the article as saying that banshee cry is the quality that now allows him to sing in big theaters and take them by storm. He took that penetrating sound and put velvet around it. So the da capo aria form was around before Handel, but he refined it into an extraordinary instrument for character development and the depiction of complex emotional states. The basic form, the da capo aria form, is the A section, the contrasting B section, and the A section again with ornaments, but as you listen to these arias, you hear characters working through their feelings. The flashy arias with lots of florid singing, like Vivi Tirano from Rodelinda and A Dispetto from Tamerlano, are exciting and deservedly famous. However, the ones that Andreas Scholl is singing tonight are from the subtler side of the art. Vatacito is Caesar in his confident, wily mode. He is in Egypt, being entertained by Ptolomeo, Cleopatra's wicked brother, but he knows perfectly well that Ptolomeo plans to murder him. This aria is all about hunting and stalking, from the horn obligato that follows the vocal line and the tiptoeing rhythm. The two other arias are laments, and I think that with all due credit to Handel's fabulous rage arias, the laments are the most wonderful. Ore de per pietà comes towards the end of Giulio Cesare when a lot has happened. Caesar has survived the battle with Ptolomeo's army, but his forces are defeated, and he thinks that Cleopatra, whom he loves, is dead. Dove se comes towards the beginning of Rodelinda, and it's our introduction to the character of Bertorido, the king who starts out bereft. His throne and his wife have been usurped, and the aria is about his longing for his wife, Rodelinda, whose loss encapsulates the loss of his place in the world. These arias are all about pathos and stillness, and being absolutely in the moment. The singer has to find very subtle ways to use the ornaments and the da capo to heighten that pathos. You can't just add lots of notes. Just a few subtly chosen and placed will make the point. So listen for what Andreas Scholl does in those da capos and see if you think that he did it well. Ornaments and arias are just one example of how important the individual performers were in the creation of these operas. They wrote their own to demonstrate their particular skills and artistry. Lengthy operas made up of these arias are unfolding character dramas, not just lots of flashy performances strung together. The concert Alcina that was done at Carnegie Hall last month with the English concert conducted by Harry Bickett was a case in point. Joyce DiDonato, as the sorceress heroine, made her 6 arias into a spectacular character arc from a woman in love at the height of her power and confidence to one whose magic has been completely destroyed. And talk about mainstream, that kept a full house, Carnegie Hall, of Handel fans ecstatic for 4 hours. And then you have Bach, who is, if anything, more searing in his depiction of the human condition than Handel. The sacred cantatas and the passions are also music drama, but with a different goal and audience in mind. Bach's audience was the Lutheran congregation, and his text was the liturgy. Music is part and parcel of Lutheranism. Martin Luther himself maintained that without music, man is little more than a stone, but with music, he can drive the devil away. I recently read the conductor John Eliot Gardner's book, Bach, Music in the Castle of Heaven. And if you haven't read it, I really recommend it. It was riveting because it is the result of a performer's lifetime total immersion in the vocal music of Bach. Gardner, who's one of the great historical performance pioneers, has really lived Bach's music. And for example, in 2000, marking the 250th anniversary of the composer's death, Gardner and his Monteverdi choir and orchestra undertook a year-long Bach cantata pilgrimage in which they traveled around Europe and finally to New York for a couple of concerts with the goal of performing all the surviving church cantatas on the liturgical feasts for which they were written. And that was 13 countries, 50 cities, 59 concerts, and 198 cantatas over the course of a year. One of the most fascinating aspects of the book is how Gardner talks about the relationship between words and music in Bach. He says, in the interplay, this is Gardner's quote, in the interplay, even friction between words and music in his church cantatas, a strong sense emerges of Bach reaching for the definitive, summative formulation of meaning. In the process, he seems constantly to be challenging his listeners to consider what it means to be a Christian, freighted with obligations as well as joys. So it's a dialectical relationship rather than a smooth fusion, and Gardner goes on to say, Bach refuses to be cowed by the solemnity of the liturgy. So often, while the text may be telling you one thing, the music is telling you something else, and as you are subconsciously absorbing conflicting information, the bigger message is delivered. So tonight's cantata 170, and I'll do my German here, Vergnügte Ruhe, beliebte Seelenlust, Contented Rest, Beloved Heart's Delight, was part of the 3rd series of Leipzig cantatas written for the 6th Sunday after Trinity, July 28, 1726. And the Handel arias were from 1724 and 1725, so it's all around the same time, which is nice. Bach wrote 2 other cantatas for solo alto in the same period, so he must have had a very good boy soloist because they did not use castrati in the Lutheran Church. The first aria in the cantata is a gorgeous, alluring, lullaby-like pastoral in 12/8 with the oboe d'amore, which has that very distinctive hooty sound, and it seems to go with the text, which is all about finding rest in heavenly concord. You can get completely sucked in by this idea of beauty and peace, but don't. In a serendipitous coincidence, I recently went to hear the conductor Harry Bickett do a master class with the Juilliard Historical Performance students, and one of the performances was this aria. Bickett told them, don't be seduced by beauty, and showed them the places where Bach is telling you something quite different in the music, the cello line that drives a key change in the introduction into a more unsettled state, and the darker colorations on words like sins and weak. So what you get is something a lot more complex, an emotional truth about uncertainty and the struggle against sin that is always present. What I really loved was Bickett's last suggestion to the students. He told them to go to the Frick collection and look at Bellini's painting of St. Francis in Ecstasy, which he described as someone totally at peace with the good and the bad. That is what makes this music come alive. Then comes the second aria when we get to the really bad behavior. How I pity these wayward hearts, or perverted mortals, as I've seen it translated, who take pleasure in vengeance and hate. The highly unusual feature of this aria is that the organ, which is usually the continuo instrument, gets liberated from the bass line and plays a wild obbligato. And even more crazily, there is no basso continuo at all in the second aria. And the continuo, as far as Bach and his contemporaries were concerned, was the underpinning of all music. And as a sometime viola da gamba continuo player myself, I can assert that we are the most important piece of the puzzle. So by leaving it out, he's making a very particular statement about those wayward, unmoored souls. And there's plenty of wild stuff in the vocal line too, so the effect is complete. And the third aria is about how death is the best way to avoid sin and therefore a consummation devoutly to be wished. The music's character is triumphant, and even though the text talks about finding rest, the aria is energetic. We got out from under our burdens, so let's dance, which makes death quite the joyful resolution, I guess, if you are a Lutheran. One of the great things about the historical performance movement has been its sense of exploration. When musicians were looking at something that nobody had played in 200 years, there was no received tradition to follow. And if there was, as in the case with Bach and Handel, they were turning it on its head. So something as small as not playing every eighth note the same, or making up your own ornaments, or figuring out, as a keyboard continuo player, how to realize a bass line from numbers, and pick which notes to play and which notes not to play, depending on what your soloists were doing, is a heady kind of freedom. Modern classical musicians don't really learn how to improvise. Historical performance requires it. And then there's the fun of actually feeling how your instrument tells you something new about the music. I have a harpsichordist friend who says that when he plays restored antique instruments, they actually say to him, well, you could do it that way, but this way would be much better. Historical performance has always included the element of surprise and discovery for the musicians and for the audience. It's interesting that a number of the young historical performance musicians coming out of the Juilliard program switch hit between HP and contemporary music. And the young musicians who are the most curious are still out there digging up still more obscure composers. I came across a young cellist and gamba player who put together an 11-member string band called Acronym to record 25 sonatas by Johann Petzel. And how many of you have heard Johann Petzel? All right, there you go, okay. However, one thing that has happened, and as more and more musicians start getting involved with this way of performing, is that ideas start getting passed down from teachers. And some musicians just starting out are not as likely to dig around in the scores and the treatises and figure out the answers for themselves. I think that this could be a loss. If everything is known, you risk ossifying the performance tradition and the repertoire once again. Another sign of the impact of early music on the mainstream is events sponsored by major institutions. Just in the last few weeks, there have been several of them in New York. I mentioned the Alcina, with Handel fans packing Carnegie Hall, and I think that it is interesting that Joyce DiDonato, who is as big an opera superstar as we get these days, is firmly rooted in the opera repertoire that wouldn't have been on the radar 20 years ago. Another show that I saw recently, How Like an Angel, was completely offbeat. It paired I Fagiolini, an early music vocal ensemble, with Circa, an avant-garde circus troupe, and was performed in a high vaulted chapel to sacred music by the likes of Tallis and Hildegard von Bingen, and the acrobats did choreographed feats of balance, suspension, and strength that conversed with the music in a really powerful way. And the big institutions are now taking an interest in performing the repertoire. We had the rush of Handel operas, and now orchestras, which had backed off from the big Bach work after the historical performance people started doing them, are starting to make bids to reclaim them. The hottest ticket in New York this fall was the Berlin Philharmonic doing Bach's St. Matthew Passion at the Armory, which was presented by Lincoln Center. This production was created in 2010, staged by Peter Sellers in the Berlin Philharmonie. It's available on video if anybody wants to see it. For New York, the distinctive in-the-round vineyard seating of the Philharmonie was recreated in the vast hall of the Armory with bleachers of spectators looking down on the performance platform below. There were 2 performances which sold out way in advance, 1,700 seats each, so they sold the tickets to the dress rehearsal for $125 apiece, and those all went too. Peter Sellers' idea was to break down the barrier between performers and audience and turn the whole event into a ritual of communal grieving. The singers, the soloists and choruses, all dressed in black, moved around and interacted, and as did some of the solo instrumentalists. The evangelist, the wonderful tenor Mark Padmore, became not just the storyteller, but the avatar for Jesus, with much enacting of physical suffering, while the baritone singing Jesus became progressively more remote in the space, so that by the time he sang the last words on the cross, he was invisible in the darkness somewhere in the far reaches of the bleachers. The singer representing Pilate sang his lines from the midst of the audience. Now, this is very Peter Sellers, making the point about the audience's complicity in Pilate's actions. And Magdalena Kozena, who sang all the alto arias, became a Mary Magdalene figure throughout, emoting and massaging, dare I say, fondling the evangelist Christ avatar figure. It was a huge hit. Everybody seemed to love it. And the reviews were euphoric. There was lots of rapturous language from people who had seen it, and I was entirely expecting to love it too. I find the St. Matthew Passion to be perhaps the most shattering piece of music I know, and I'm not even a Christian. And as for staging it, well, as an opera person, I'm all for staged vocal music. I saw Jonathan Miller's staging of the St. Matthew several times. It too freed the choristers from their scores and had soloists interact with the instrumentalists playing the obligatos in their arias. It suggested different levels of discourse, the conflict of the big groups, the intimacy of the arias, and it was very moving. The Berlin production at the Armory left me completely cold, and I spent a lot of time afterwards trying to figure out why that was. And I think that as critics, sometimes we have this dilemma when everybody and your colleagues, the audience, everybody thinks that this is just the most amazing thing that ever happened, and you're saying, like, was I there? So I finally decided that the over-emotive literalness of the physicality really put me off. The musical performances were beautiful, but very smooth. The Berlin Phil doesn't play early instruments, and all the edge and the action was in what you were looking at. Also, Sellers turned the singers into characters, and by doing so, for me, he had the opposite effect of what he said he intended. Rather than drawing me into the experience as an active participant experiencing grief, guilt, and catharsis, he turned me into an observer watching a show with representational characters as he told me explicitly what I was supposed to be feeling at any particular moment. It is an interesting problem, since when Bach wrote these cantatas and passions, their complex alchemy was intended to engender religious feeling. If you present them to an audience that is, if not mostly secular, probably not majority Lutheran, how do you get the full impact? I think that the answer is in the music and in Bach's ability as a musical dramatist to portray the whole range of the human condition, and it is better not to be distracted from what the music is telling you. So I'll quote Gardner again. "You are not being obliged to subscribe to a doctrine, for Bach's approach, even at his most vehement, is not a moral fitness program imposed on us. Instead, the defining quality lies in how he conveys his understanding of exactly what it is to be human, with all our faults, fears, and blind spots, interpreting the word to us like a great novelist, capturing the sense of life itself." So listening to Bach's church music centuries later in an entirely different milieu, Gardner says, it is easier for us to recognize the potency of his music and its ability simultaneously to reveal, even insist upon, the unvarnished truth about human weakness, man's thin and easily broken attachment to moral good, and to chart the redemptive way back to decency, compassion, and what he called good neighborliness. We emerge from performing or listening to a Bach motet chastened, maybe, but more often elated. Such is the cleansing power of the music. There is not a whiff here of those foul fumes of religious fervor, spreading sanctimoniousness and intolerance throughout the globe, while those far from exclusively Christian virtues, love, mercy, peace, and pity, are choked. So in thinking about Bach's Passion and its purpose, I started thinking about a contemporary composer's attempt to use that form, John Adams' The Death of Klinghoffer. And I'm sorry, everybody, because all the people at the Rubin Institute have probably heard so much about the death of Klinghoffer in the last couple of days but I mean, it was in there already, so I'll just put it back. It has been, and perhaps the rest of you all know that there was a huge contretemps over this staging of this 1991 opera by the Metropolitan Opera just in the last month. So this is an opera written in 1991 about the 1985 hijacking of the cruise ship Achille Lauro by Palestinian terrorists and their murder of an elderly disabled Jewish-American passenger, Leon Klinghoffer. It has been a lightning rod ever since its premiere, with Jewish groups insisting that it's anti-Semitic, that the terrorist act is given justification, and that the piece presents a moral equivalence between the actions of the Palestinians and the Jews in Israel. The Met is, of course, a huge target, and New York is the epicenter of the Jewish community, so the outcry was pretty intense and nasty. In an attempted compromise, the Met pulled the production from the HD movie schedule, but it didn't help. There was a big protest outside Lincoln Center on the opening night of the show with all manner of elected officials, religious leaders, and lots of others, most of whom had never seen the opera, using some very inflammatory language, such as Gelb takes money from terrorists. And I'm bringing this up because the opera is really structured like the Bach Passions. The choruses that comment poetically on the background of the action are key. The captain is the storyteller, evangelist figure, and there are a handful of witnesses, in addition to the principal actors, Klinghoffer, his wife Marilyn, and the 4 terrorists. The piece toggles back and forth among these, as the Passions do. The choruses offer historical, even mythic context for the two peoples at odds, the Palestinians and the Jews, while in the foreground, the hijacking and the murder unfold in real time. Part of the issue with Klinghoffer is the absolutism of the piece's enemies. If you present the Palestinians as human beings with grievances, you are anti-Semitic. In a sense, Bach had it easier. The St. Matthew doesn't give Christ's killers a point of view, and the deck is pretty seriously stacked in any case. It does, however, suggest the communal guilt of the listeners. Christ died for our sins, after all, and that is a painful message to take on board. Adams and his librettist, Alice Goodwin, were perhaps less skillful than Bach was at making their complex message clear. The current Met production, which is explicitly about the violence of the Palestinians' feelings and behavior, and in showing the actual killing not once but twice, clarifies matters by driving the story in a straight line. The hijackers were murderers, it was wrong. The original production by Peter Sellers, who conceived the piece with Adams and Goodman, was by contrast very abstract, leaving the audience to get the message however it would. One of the most passion-like things about the opera, however, is the strangest. The character of Klinghoffer is analogous to the crucified Christ, and his wife Marilyn, who gets the last word, is like a mourning, wounded Mary. You would think that the Jewish protesters would be up in arms about that, but of course, they haven't seen it. As it turned out, despite the action outside, the expected disruptions of the actual performances were pretty minimal. One of my colleagues was speculating beforehand about what the protesters might do. He mentioned a disruption at the Rome Opera some years ago, where a very conservative Catholic group once protested a production of Wozzeck by dropping a lot of white mice off the balcony onto the heads of the people on the orchestra level. Apparently, the theater cleared out instantly. And I'm glad nobody suggested this, because someone probably would have done it. Nothing like that actually happened at Klinghoffer. Perhaps the foul fumes of religious fervor were actually quelled by the piece. Maybe they were convinced by the music and discovered that it is possible to absorb two conflicting ideas at the same time. In any case, for me, it does come together here. This is a modern take on an early music form with a contemporary subject that has roots in the distant past that arouses strong feelings. And this is what makes the art form new. And to go back to the historical performance movement, that is what it has done. It has made the art form new, and it has made us pay attention once again.